Good afternoon. Thank you, Tom, for that kind introduction, and also to Berkley Center for inviting me here to Georgetown. It's truly good to be here. We wanted to use our time to discuss, if you would, at least something more substantive about how to make sense about continuity and change in Iranian politics. Beyond the headlines that we read about Iran, which is dominated by discussions of the nuclear issue, by discussions of the virulent rhetoric of the Iranian president, Iran presents very interesting case for those who are interested in the Muslim world, who are interested in Middle East politics, and who are interested also in debates about how societies and governments transition from one form of government to another. When we look at Iran today, we see some contradictory images, which don't fit easily into any particular box or any particular classification with which we are familiar. We look at the country and we see a theocracy, which in of itself is unique anywhere in the world, any constitution that gives power to an unaccountable and unelected religious leader. We see a country that is ruled by generally an authoritarian regime. At this point in time, it is confident in its own capabilities regionally as well as domestically. It appears to be stable and has even hegemonic regional ambitions in the region. But we also look at, there's also a different picture in Iran. One is that we've seen significant amount of political activity of the kind that we're usually not familiar with in the Middle East. For instance, in 1997, there was an election in Iran in which, despite the wishes of the Iran's supreme leader and the conservative clerical establishment, the reformist candidate won, and the results of the elections stood. There have been continuous student demonstrations and student agitation in Iran, which suggests that there is certain fervor going on within the Iranian society. It is a country which has probably more civil society and civic activity than any other. It has the largest number of bloggers per capita anywhere in the Middle East. Persian is, for instance, the third largest language on the internet after English and Mandarin Chinese, with something like 85,000 weblogs going on. And it's probably the only country in the region that had a former president alive living in his own country. And if we looked at the results of elections just about 2 months ago, December election, the headlines that it produced would not be seen in any other Middle Eastern country. The president is embarrassed at the polls by his own population and wins no more than a third of the seats that he contested. And at the time when he's at loggerheads with Washington, he would have headlines in the New York Times saying Iranian president humbled and the like. Now, it also is true that it is also a country in which the Iranian president is the head of state, but is also not the head of state at the same time. But all of this said is that Iran presents a very complicated picture. Not only a complicated picture as far as governance and the shape of state in the Middle East is concerned, but more interestingly, it provides a very complicated, and I would say, not just for policymakers, but also for those in academia, a very rich case of studying political transition. I mean, without a doubt, Iran in the past 15 years has been involved in a process of recalibrating state power and redefining state power and trying to create a new stable state domination of society. So unlike most other Middle Eastern countries, it's actually in a period of transition. We're not looking at Iran today at a point of looking at a stable, static picture. We're looking at a changing picture. Now, Iran is unique. It's the only country in the Middle East which is grappling this not from a position of a secular dictatorship coming under threat by Islamic forces, but rather an Islamic dictatorship coming under threat by secular forces. It is a post-revolutionary regime of the kind that we don't have in the region. So in some ways we're grappling with a recreation of a state in a post-revolutionary circumstance. And also when we look at Iran, we see all the other issues that are at debate everywhere else on the table. Relationship of Islam and democracy, relationship of Islam and state power, domination of state over society, absence of freedoms of various kinds, human rights, women's rights, civil society activity, except that in the case of Iran, everything comes from a very different angle, and we're also probably proceeding to a very different result. Now, to understand where things are now, we have to look at where things came from. In other words, what did the Iranian Revolution actually produce? Iranian Revolution produced a unique kind of a state, which is more akin to what we saw in China or in Russia after the revolution. In other words, using a terminology from the French Revolution, a Jacobin state. A state that was ideologically energetic, dynamic, believed in national independence, redistribution of resources towards the poor. It believed in social development. It wanted to export its ideas abroad. It was overconfident in terms of having got it right, its own image in what its ideology suggested. Now, it was not a surprise that the Iranian state ended up being a lot larger after the revolution than it was before. It was capable of legislating a lot more. It dominated the Iranian economy a lot more. For instance, we can look at the Iranian economy today. About 80% of it is state-dominated. It expanded the size of the state, so the bureaucracy became a lot bigger. And the Iranian state, after the revolution, penetrated the private sector of individual lives far more aggressively and successfully than it had done before the revolution, legislating far more thoroughly about personal behavior, personal dress, cultural issues, and the like. So, I mean, beyond this discussion of whether Iran is a theocracy or not, whether it's conservative or not, the most important issue on the table is the size and capability of the Iranian state, its ability to dominate, its ability to legislate, and its ability to get its way. I mean, that's really is the most important issue. And that is not a function of the Islam part of the Islamic Republic. It's a function of what the revolution produced. Revolutions produce large states that ultimately dominate society. Now, in Iran's case, this has not necessarily produced a stable circumstance for varieties of reasons. One is that the Iranian Revolution was ultimately isolated regionally, and it was isolated internationally. It was cut out of international markets. Even up to recent times, it has been under various forms of sanctions that have hampered its economy. And therefore, the kind of post-revolutionary state that was produced was wobbly. And it became even wobblier as a consequence of the Iran-Iraq war, because it inflicted enormous amount of pain on the population. And as is the case with all wars, they demand a great deal of contribution of resources from the population. But the Iran-Iraq war did not produce a victory for Iran. And ultimately, the challenges of reconstruction, economic pressures that it produced, and the rebuff that the regime got as a consequence of not winning the Iran-Iraq war made this relations between state and society problematic. Now, this problem has surfaced in recent years in forms of two very powerful critiques in Iran towards both dimensions of the Islamic Republic. Both towards the Islam side of it, by generating a very robust and prolific debate about Islamic reform in Iran. And the second part of it, namely the Republic part of it, by generating this very robust and strong debate about political reform in Iran. And both of these are important dynamics in Iranian society, namely debates about the role of Islam and reform of Islam, and secondly about constitutional reform and rolling back the extensive capacity of the state to penetrate society and regulate social behavior. Now, the Jacobin state, the Iranian state, has tried to deal with these problems through multiple ways. Firstly, during the decade of 1988 to 1997, it toyed with trying to shift from being a revolutionary state to being something akin to an Islamic developmental state. In other words, to try to jumpstart the Iranian economy, privatize the public sector, privatize some segments of the economy, and try to create a private sector that would address some of the economic problems the country faced. And in some ways, it had certain success. In other words, there was more privatization in Iran in that decade and the one subsequent to it than in most other countries around Iran. In fact, one can understand the phenomenon of the Iranian president Ahmadinejad only largely in terms of a backlash against privatization and globalization of the kind that you see in Latin America. In other words, class difference in Iran expanded, the relationship between rich and poor became wider, the private sector benefited from a great deal of this privatization, as did many Iranian leaders who became corrupt and became more like the Russian oligarchs than the pristine revolutionaries who had carried out the Iranian Revolution. And the poor did not get benefit from the turn of events, and in some ways what happened in Iran has closer parallel in Latin America, in Bolivia, Ecuador, and Venezuela than it has in what's happening in Egypt, Jordan, and the like. And in fact, that is one of the paradoxes about Iran. And many of the revolutionary elite were actually sidelined during this period. One of the important shifts that happened in that decade is that Islamic revolution from the very beginning had two components to it, Islam and revolution. And these were led by different factions. There were those who were more interested in the Islam, and there were those who were more interested in the revolution. The first decade of the Iranian Revolution was dominated by those who were more interested in revolution. I mean, these were really Islamic Marxists, people who spoke the language of Islam, but their mental framework was essentially Marxist-Leninist. And when Iran made the transition in '88, this group were sidelined. And this group later on would emerge as the pro-democracy reformists. And in fact, most of the bad blood that what Washington has with Iran is with the very people that he wants to support now. The conservatives who took over Iran, which were more interested in the Islam side of things, were not really instrumental in the first decade of the revolution. And I think it's very sort of a symbolic statement is the fact that Ahmadinejad was not allowed to participate in the taking of hostages. He was not one of them. Doesn't mean that he was a nice guy or that he necessarily meant well. It meant that he was not part of the leftist Islamic cabal that was running the show at the time. He surged at the time when that cabal was actually marginalized. Now, the shift in the Iranian state between '88 and '97 was not thorough. In other words, Iran wanted to economically open up, but there was pressure that it would not accommodate on the revolutionary side of things. So there was no opening with the West. There was no opening with the United States. And in that decade, Iran on the one side was adopting new models from the World Bank in terms of how to restructure Iranian economy and how to privatize and how to set up a stock exchange, but was still continuing to support Hezbollah in Lebanon or sanction a number of acts, which ultimately would end up, the last one of which was the Kobar Tower and the like. So there was a great deal of disconnect between what kind of international environment and foreign policy was required to support the economic changes from below. Now, the development in Iran, the economic side of things, also created its own political dynamic. Namely, it developed certain vested interest in large state domination of the industry and investment in infrastructure and large projects in Iran. But also it created tensions with the traditional bazaar and smaller businessmen who were very close to the revolution, but who did not necessarily benefit from the privatization and the economic opening. Now, all of these issues came to a head in the 1997 elections. In other words, the key question was how could Iran go to the next step, from the initial attempt to reform the revolutionary state, how could it achieve a stable environment? And at that point in time, it was very clear that there was no, with Ayatollah Khomeini having left the scene in 89, there was no solid domination at the top. there was factionalism over all of these issues, whether you support the bazaar or you support large industry, you support Islamic issues or you're committed to the revolutionary issues, you support opening with the West or not. And there was no way to settle these problems other than essentially throwing it out to the voters. And at that point in time, elections became very decisive in settling these struggles of power within the Iranian political system. So in some ways it's true that Iran does not have a real democracy. Not everybody can participate in elections. The list of candidates are continuously called for those who are appropriate in terms of the regime. But it's a reality that once that list is completed, then there is nobody who can decide who wins. And so long as the issues that are being debated and voted for are viewed as legitimate within the system, then there is real competition about who wins. Now, the elections was supposed to stabilize the Islamic Republic in the sense of settling a lot of these issues that transformation of the state had brought to the fore. But ironically, it actually posed much more existential questions to them. So in 1997, once the reformists won, the issue before the Islamic Republic was very clear. Would it embrace change and therefore further integrate a broader cross-section of society, so be a more watered down and potentially more stable Islamic Republic? So the way that at that point in time people were saying the Soviet Union went under Gorbachev. But I think many Iranian leaders really didn't think the Russian model ended up being a good one, if the disintegration of the Soviet Union was anything to go by. And the alternative argument was that stability would actually not come by opening up, but will come with retrenchment. And this whole debate found far more resonance because as it happens, between 1997 and 2001, the leadership of Iran began to feel a pincer, if you would, threat. One was obviously from the reformists who had won the elections. The other one was from the United States. And the more they felt that there is a danger, that the movement from below and the movement from the outside would come together and undo the entire state, the more they became, their whole strategy became one of a strategy of survival. I mean, many reformists now say that the single biggest mistake of the Clinton administration was to argue that they would only talk to the reformists, not to the Iranian regime, by which they meant that they wanted to divide and therefore undo the other faction, which meant that they gave every incentive to the other faction to try to block an engagement with the US if the outcome of that engagement was to be their undoing. So the question of stabilizing and calibrating state-society relations became increasingly in the past decade one of trying to build, if you would, a conservative middle. In other words, whereas most of our attention was how quickly can Iran actually democratize, real force in Iran between 1997 and 2005 and on to today is one of conservative consolidation. So the regime began, and by the regime I mean the supreme leader, the clerical elite, those who felt threatened by both the US posture towards Iran and by the greater reformist power domestically, began to invest in ways in which they would shore up authority. And they did this, first of all, by investing in ideology. In other words, there was a re-emphasis in ideological retrenchment, not of the revolutionary kind, but of the conservative Islamic kind. And the people who were leading this were not people who were involved in the first decade of the revolution, the leftist part of the revolution, but the Islamic part of the revolution. In fact, one of the chief ideologues of this time period is an Ayatollah. Some of you may have heard of him, Ayatollah Misbah Yazdi, who actually visited Washington. I don't know how he managed that in the 1990s. Maybe he was here too, I don't know. But Misbah Yazdi is actually the spiritual leader of Ahmadinejad. Now, one of the critiques that reformists make of Misbah Yazdi is that they don't know where he was during the years of the revolution. He was nowhere to be seen during that first decade. He was a non-personality, and in the first year of the revolution, he was not on anything that mattered. But that's exactly the point, that these are not your original revolutionaries. These are sort of the inheritors of change. There was also a greater emphasis on consolidating power under the supreme leader. In other words, the policy of retrenchment meant that you have to, if the Iranian presidency is going to be the instrument of reformists and potentially the instrument of the United States in Iran, then you have to take powers away from it. And you have to concentrate power in those institutions of the state that were close to the reformists. So this was military forces like Iran's Revolutionary Guards. It was various councils and institutions that were associated with his core ideology, and he was in the office of the supreme leader in Iran, which after all, constitutionally, is the last line of defense of the Islamic Republic. Economically, however, there was a problem here. In other words, the regime wanted to maintain the growth of the private sector, and wanted to sort of keep the foreign investment that was coming into Iran. And they began to toy with ideas such as, following a China model, which means political retrenchment but economic opening. In fact, Iran sent a number of delegations to China to study what might be the potentiality for implementing a China model in Iran. And the model, obviously, in Iran didn't take hold. It never was seriously contemplated by the regime, and none of the sort of political reforms or opening to the West that goes with that model was ever implemented. But it did create the context for something very interesting, that if conservatives are to rule over Iran satisfactorily, then they have to somehow create a marriage with reformists and with the private sector in Iran. And the basic argument became that you can have political conservatives, and then they could appropriate and adopt many of the arguments and political program of the reformists. And you can have it, what at that point in time sometimes were even called conservative reformists or pragmatic conservatives. The problem was, and still is in Iran, and that's really at the heart of the issue, is that ultimately any of these formulations, whether it's the China model, whether it is the continuation of reformism, or whether it's pragmatic conservatism, requires crossing an ideological red line in Iran, in terms of the regime's commitment to its core political religious values. And in many ways, the Iranian regime has come right to the edge, and then has tried to find a way to go around it. It is not being comfortable crossing that line, mainly because it believes the crossing of that line, given the current international environment and hostility with the US, creates existential threats to the regime. Because there's not a belief that you can sustain the Islamic Republic, given the outside pressure, if you take that critical step behind the red line. And this vacillation over whether or not they can cross that line was really the opening for the coming to the fore of Ahmadinejad, because he presented the elite with sort of an alternate model that did not require accommodating reformists, accommodating middle class, crossing any red lines. So you could essentially have your cake and eat it too, as he argued. So you're going to have a powerful state, conservative values, even further retrenchment, combined with economic populism, using the high oil money in order to avoid having to deal with privatization and the like. In fact, when he ran in his campaign, Ahmadinejad didn't talk about any of the issues he's become famous for. He didn't talk about the nuclear issue. He didn't talk about the United States much, other than to say he doesn't favor positive relations with the US. He didn't talk about Israel at all, and he definitely didn't talk about the Holocaust while he was on the campaign trail. What he talked about continuously was that we don't need the private sector. We don't need a private sector. We don't need the kind of economic reforms that the Iranian elite is debating. We can preserve state subsidies, and there's enough oil money to spend on the economy. Now, in many ways, the elections that happened in 2005 was not about democracy versus dictatorship, the way we saw it in the West. It was not about Islam versus secularism. It was really about different models for stabilizing the Islamic Republic. And the two essentially important models on the table were the one that the conservative, pragmatist conservatives were putting forward, which is yes to authoritarianism, but then you continue with liberalizing the Iranian economy, a version of the China model. And the one that Ahmadinejad put forward, which is kind of more like Chavez model, combination of populism with authoritarianism. Now, there were a set of issues that were on the table and are still on the table in Iran, and it's really key. In other words, the election bypassed many of these things, but they're still there. And those are the issues that are decide in some ways the election results we saw last month, and also will decide where we go here. One is that ever since 1997, this conservative consolidation has gone hand in hand with concentration of power in the hands of the supreme leader. There's no way of going around that. Now, we in the West sort of think, have our own perceptions of this. When the reformist President Khatami was leading Iran, I remember everybody would say, there's no point in focusing on him, he's irrelevant. And then when Ahmadinejad became president, then he's everything. In reality is that Iran will always have a competition of power between the president and the supreme leader. It's not about ideology, it's not about policy, it's about who has more power. And I don't think the supreme leader, even on the best of days, would want to give any of the powers he has to a president. And when Ahmadinejad was becoming president, he said on the campaign trail repeatedly that I don't want to be an administrative president. In other words, I want to actually wield real power. Now, this was not settled at that point, but increasingly it's now resurfacing. In other words, ultimately, as Ahmadinejad tries to assert himself, he's encroaching on the powers of the supreme leader. And whether the supreme leader likes what Ahmadinejad is saying or not, he, I think, has got interested in making sure Ahmadinejad doesn't get too comfortable with power. So he recently slapped him on the nuclear issue, basically saying, I decide foreign policy, not you. The second issue that was on the table then is that throughout the years of conservative consolidation, Iranian politics had become increasingly militarized. The more and more positions of power transferred to the Revolutionary Guards. For instance, a third of the Iranian parliament today is either Revolutionary Guard veterans or active Revolutionary Guards officers. Some of the largest corporations in Iran are associated with the Revolutionary Guards. Number of high-level officials are from the Revolutionary Guards. Now, you could read this two ways. I mean, Revolutionary Guard commanders in Iran say, we look to our west, we see militaries in control. We look to our east, we see militaries in control. Why not in Iran? By which they mean Turkey and Pakistan. And many Revolutionary Guard commanders often talk about the Musharraf model, because we want them to talk about other models, and we like Musharraf to be known for moderate Islam, but the Muslim world sees him as a successful case of selling a marriage between military rule and technocracy to Washington. And their argument is, the same arguments you hear from Musharraf. Namely, the militaries are more efficient, they're more technocratic. Who wants to deal with the parliament? It's messy, they can never get anything done. And that is the argument that often Revolutionary Guard commanders make in Iran as well. Namely, the solution to Iran's problems is military. It's a kind of Bonapartism, or if you want to call it the Iranian politics is somewhat infatuated with the Putin model. That's the operative model of a strong hand. And that hasn't gone away. In other words, we still talk about what is the level of involvement of the Revolutionary Guards in Iranian politics. And more important issues that were not clear as to whether this disturbance in civil-military relations in Iran is necessarily a bad thing. In fact, generals with vested interest in large corporations may be far easier to deal with than Puritan ones, who are sitting in Spartan barracks, ready to take decisive action. Thirdly, is that it is a fact in Iranian politics that a lot of Iranian politics has now become local politics. local elections matter a lot more. We just saw it in a month ago. The power of local elections in deciding budgets and in deciding many things has become quite sizable and notable in Iran. In other words, whatever value voting has had at the top has now sort of filtered down into society. You often find villages, local towns with elected municipal councils. And at the local level, people don't vote over grandiose ideas like democracy, relations with the US, or nuclear issue. They vote, just like in the US, over bread and butter issues. Who's going to build their roads? Who's going to dig their ditches? Who's going to build schools and the like? And this helped Ahmadinejad because essentially he ran a presidential campaign which was largely a local campaign. So he promised many things to many people in many poor areas. But ironically, he is now also hamstrung by the very fact that he cannot control the flow of local politics. And finally is the problem of private sector in Iran. Iran has a relatively robust private sector. Even though the state dominates the Iranian economy, the role and the size and the role of the private sector is important. And in many ways, Ahmadinejad's solution all along was that Iran really doesn't need the private sector, which is the same thing Chavez says about Venezuela in some ways. And the argument was that you could base this on the high price of oil, so Iran can behave much more as a rentier state. It does not have to undertake any reforms that would empower the private sector. But the issue of the private sector hasn't gone away. The issue was on the table in 2005. Again, it's on the table right now, mainly because the populist economy has not actually paid that much dividend. So now that we look at sort of where is this project of stabilization of Iranian state and its relations with Iranian society go, there still is no definite answer. In other words, none of these approaches, whether the reformist one or the one under Ahmadinejad, has actually been able to stabilize the relations between state and society in Iran, which still continues to be the key driving dynamic. And the issues that are driving this debate are not issues of only about secularization or democratization. The more important issues for the masses are issues of governance, of issues of delivering social services and economic goods, which really goes to the heart of what kind of a relationship does the state have with society, a satisfactory one or not. And at the top, the state has been able to consolidate and gain power, but it has to solve these key issues. Namely, how is it going to handle the private sector? How is it going to handle distribution of resources? And how is it going to handle the changing sort of dynamic of society? How is it going to also balance the relations between various factions, president and supreme leader, as well as between the civilian and the military wings of the state? And the only new added dimension to this is that this is now happening in a much more volatile international environment for Iran. And the difference that makes is that since 1997, despite the fact that there always was a US threat or interest in regime change, much of this debate had only a domestic component to it. In other words, the external factors did not matter as much in setting the context for the debate. But currently, the foreign policy environment and what implications either acceptance of Iran's greater regional role or an overt effort to unroll it, particularly if it ends up in military confrontation, is likely to have on that debate domestically. Anyways, since time is up, I'll stop here, and then if you have any questions, I'll be very happy to continue the discussion.
Thank you, Vali, for that very concise and comprehensive overview of the situation in Iran. And thank you also for leaving some time for questions. We want to broaden the conversation. We've got about 20 minutes. So I would ask folks who have a question, the acoustics here are not very good, so if you please stand up, project, tell us your name, maybe a little bit about your affiliation and pose a short question, and we'll have a chance to continue here.
My name is Ariel Aram. I'm a grad student in the government department. I wanted to push you on the analogy you made between Ahmadinejad and Chavez and Morales. We don't see in the New York Times that Chavez and Morales are being rebuffed by their constituency. We don't hear that. In fact, the opposite. What's the difference? I wonder if you could elaborate on the difference, particularly in their relationship to the oil sector. It's an analogy that I use a lot, but I wanted to hear what your understanding of it and where the similarities and where the difference is.
Well, the similarity is really essentially in their conception of use of populism, in terms of both in terms of managing the economy as well as in terms of shoring up state power. The other similarity between Iran and Venezuela in particular is the perception of the external threat, and that the role that plays in justifying the necessity for concentration of power and expanding the state's reach. But where there's a difference is that Ahmadinejad, unlike Chavez, does not have sufficient control to impose his iron will, if you would, on the country, and particularly to shut down the political process. In other words, he could not control the elections in Iran. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is that he doesn't control all the levers of power. He appoints people who are within the administrative structure of the state, but he doesn't control the judiciary, he doesn't control many of the important organs of state, and he doesn't appoint the heads of the military forces. And also he doesn't control these powerful foundations, which are most of the state's money is dispersed through. So, he has the limitations of being one of the main players in Iran, but not being the player. The second problem that all of them have in Iran, including the supreme leader, is that they all believe that the role of elections in Iran cannot be rolled back. A scenario like Pakistan, where you could just shut down the elections for 5-6 years, is just not feasible. In other words, they just don't have the capacity and the capability to undo it. So what they can do is try to manipulate it, or try to get their own way through varieties of ways within it. So Ahmadinejad ultimately would have to go to these elections. Again, there's going to be parliamentary elections in end of this year, and then presidential elections in 2009. And he cannot do what Chavez did, change the rules of the elections and come up with an overwhelming majority.
I'm Harley Walter. I teach in the Government Department of Civil Foreign Service. I'd like to push you a little more on what you said about militarization. Does simply being a former Revolutionary Guard make everyone the same? You indicated that there are at least two main strains in the revolution initially. Are these people really all like-minded, or are there some differences there?
First of all, we really don't have very clear visibility into the Revolutionary Guards. It was revamped in 1997 as much more of a Praetorian Guard of the regime. You have the Iranian military, and it's been there, but the Iranian military was not as trusted as the sort of the guard of the regime as the Revolutionary Guards were. And then throughout the late 1990s to the present, it expanded in two dimensions. One is that it has expanded as a military power. In other words, it's developed its own Air Force, Navy, Coast Guard, etc. And it gets the largest share of resources. And all of the main programs, like the missile program, all of those are controlled by the Revolutionary Guard, not by the regular military. Secondly was that it got into the business, into business. In other words, in that sense, it's very much like the Turkish military or like Pakistani military. That's not to say that individual guard commanders are not personally benefiting directly from things, but as an institution, it has these large foundations and corporations, and the Revolutionary Guard right now in Iran is both the largest recipient of government contracts and the largest donor of contracts to the private sector. In fact, it's the main buffer between the regime and the business community. But at the core of it, it does have a certain, if you want to call it, core belief in core mission. One is that the current class of guard commanders, those who are the sort of senior commanders, are all veterans of the Iran-Iraq War. So they're one class that came through that war, whatever it meant at that time for the Revolutionary Guards. They share a vision that they have earned the right to speak for Iran. They have shed blood and sweat at the war front. I mean, you hear, for instance, the commander of Iran's Navy had lost 4 brothers in the Iran-Iraq War. So there is this sense of that they, rather than the youth, the fun-loving youth of North Tehran, has a right to speak for the revolution. So they don't see themselves in any way as less nationalistic. And secondly, their conception of why Iran needs deterrence, why does it need nuclear capability, the enormous amount of disdain they have for international agreements, IAEA, UN, and the like. It all comes from the sort of ways in which they interpret it as a class, the Iran-Iraq War. When you listen to all of them, it's like automatons. They all say the same thing, that international agreements disappeared when Saddam used chemical weapons against Iran. Why would we trust any agreement that is sort of sanctioned internationally? So what I'm trying to say, the mindset is the same. And then between 1997 and 2005, the clerical leadership in Iran invested heavily in ideological indoctrination of the younger cadre of making sure that it is the Praetorian Guard of the regime. So, but you also hear that there are disagreements. I mean, for instance, there was a regular disagreement over whether they should support Ahmadinejad or a former Guard general who was much more pragmatic. There are questions now whether the Revolutionary Guard actually supports Ahmadinejad's foreign policy. I mean, these are also open questions. But I would compare and say to the Pakistan or Turkish military in the sense that as an institution, it has corporatist interests that it understands and tries to propagate.
Thanks for your presentation. Along the same line, talking about militarization, I wonder where the Basij fit in, and what's the difference between them and the Revolutionary Guards? Thanks.
The Basij are known as the Porter sisters of the Revolutionary Guards. The dynamic was the following, that as Revolutionary Guards throughout, after the Iran-Iraq War, the Revolutionary Guards they essentially were a militia, if you want to think of it initially, were sort of pushed in the direction of professionalization and to become a regular military force. And we can see the trajectory. They now are becoming Iran's military, period. There was still need for militias, and you still needed to send people out there to crack the heads of students and the like. And the Basij was mobilized as far more of a sort of grassroots-based young group that is on the payroll of the regime, is indoctrinated, and is used, for purposes of social control and the like. Ahmadinejad's base of power actually is not in the Revolutionary Guards, it's in the Basij. And one of the tensions it created after he became president is that he tried to organize the Basij also into a formal military force and therefore be able to give resources to them. Give them a seat at the table. And the Revolutionary Guards were the biggest opponents of that. What they didn't want was yet another military force to compete with them. I would say, in terms of command and control, we don't know where the boundary lines are, and whether there are breaks and how it works. Mainly because the Basij is kept rather informally, and so its boundaries are not very clear. I mean, the arguments is anywhere from 300,000 people to over 1 million. And how many of them are really core, and how many are periphery, we don't know.
Abiel Roswell from history here. Under the Shah's regime, there was an active effort to cultivate a sort of national identity and to project it and use it as a kind of frame of reference, both internally, I think, and in defining Iran's place in the Middle East and the broader world. Evidently not a terribly successful effort. Is there any kind of, Islamo-national or Shiite national or some kind of synthesis with national init emerging among any of the factions or regime elements currently in Iran, or is that really just out of the picture?
It's a very good question, and I would say two elements of the Shah's vision have now resurfaced. One is the developmentalism. It's in many ways, I mean, you know, this began facetiously when many Iranians began to refer to Rafsanjani during his presidency as Akbar Shah. But also more recently, it's actually being appropriated that the idea that the Pahlavi regime had about putting emphasis on development as a vocation, as a national vocation, and as a guide to government is very key. In fact, during the presidential elections of 2005, there was a lot of very veiled references to the first Pahlavi monarch, Reza Shah. And in fact, in many ways, he's the most popular, he's enormously popular in Iran. I can say that, you know, from personal experience. That, you know, but and in fact, one of the Revolutionary Guard commanders at one point said that, you know, people sing the praises of Reza Khan in coffee shops, which is he admitted, in other words, that that's the case. And he said, why? Because people are fed up with politicians and parliamentarians. And then he turned around and said, I am the Hezbollah Reza Khan, which was, you know, very clearly understanding that this Pahlavi motive of developmentalism, of getting things done, of a man on a horseback, which Reza Khan was, is extremely popular with Iranians. The second issue that is very clear is that Iran's foreign policy is the Shah's foreign policy. It is. I mean, in fact, the Shah's last foreign minister recently said that, you know, Iran's nuclear policy is identical to the one the Shah had.
Except for the Israeli dimension, though, right?
Well, there are many other dimensions. It doesn't mean that just because the vision is there that they have got it wrong. I mean, the Shahs understood that to get away with regional hegemony, you had to have an acceptable regime in the West. The current regime wants everything the Shah wanted, but without believing that it needs to present a different face to the world. But you look at websites of, you know, leading Revolutionary Guard politicians and presidential candidates, the maps of Greater Iran, the rhetoric about Greater Iran, which the Iranians used to laugh at in the 1970s when the Shah used to say it, is now everywhere. And in fact, the kind of language that the Islamic Republic uses about its hegemony in the Persian Gulf is verbatim the Shah's. Now, we don't want Saudi Arabia to become an Islamic Republic. We don't want Kuwait to become an Islamic Republic. We are the greater power here. This is our near abroad. This is our lake. And, you know, the Western world should leave it to us, and we're perfectly trustworthy. You know, the ships are going to come and go, the oil is going to come and go, but, you know, Saudi Arabia, Oman, you know, Qatar and the like should have to assume sort of a subservient position. And then all of this is put in the context of recognition of Iran's rightful place in history and Iran's rightful place in the region. All of which, you know, are sort of variations of exactly what the Shah was saying, and he was accused at that time of being a megalomaniac.
Thank you.
Right here, and then.
I'm Jocelyn, I teach at school of Naval Studies. I'm going to switch gears just a little bit. We just talked about interest in practical development and getting things done. In the last few years, the government has addressed very complex behavioral issues related to HIV, AIDS, and drug use in a very interesting way. It's not only developed policies that are rather progressive in the area of mentioned, but it's also not only allowed, but in fact encouraged NGOs to engage in prevention and treatment and so forth, some of which are really quite active including other vulnerable populations. And this is seen a rather curious approach for the government. I wonder if you could speak to what the genesis of.
First of all, Iran has a huge AIDS problem. I mean, they don't want to give out statistics, but it's a known fact that there's a huge AIDS problem. And there are multiple reasons for this. One has to do with drugs. which is now proliferating in Iran, partly because of unemployment, youth, but also it has to do with the entire drug trade of Afghanistan. I mean, over 80% of the world's heroin comes from Afghanistan. Literally all of it goes through Iran, whether it comes through Turkmenistan, Pakistan, or Afghanistan, it all goes through Iran. And ultimately, most Iranians at least believe that this is responsible for crime, for prostitution, for lack of law and order, and also for infectious diseases, including AIDS. But also it's because of Iran has a youthful population of about 70%. And in many ways, despite the sort of facade of religiosity of the state, there is a prolific, if you would, sexual interactions between the youth at all levels of society. And I think it's reached a point that the regime has recognized that without having positive education, you're going to confront an epidemic for which they're not ready, and they don't have the infrastructure of dealing with. And that rather than try to intervene with behavior of people, which I think for a while now the regime has sort of given up or is not interested in trying to police young people from interacting with one another, but rather that you have to basically do this. And therefore they become far more permissive. For instance, an NGO person I was talking recently said, for the first time in Tehran, he's seen 3 billboards that essentially talk about AIDS and prescribe use of preventive measures in public along the highway.
Stan Coburn, I'm a Georgetown alum, now with the Cato Institute. On this alleged dispute between Khamenei and Ahmadinejad, the article appeared, but Khamenei's appearances since then have been very tough. The overture to Putin on the gas cartel, and more recently, the speech to the Air Force, which was very tough regarding the United States. At the same time, they're engaging in major military exercises. One of the key facts here, to my mind, which hasn't gotten a lot of attention, a few months ago, Khamenei, as commander-in-chief, replaced the commander of the Air Force. And the report I read was that the Air Force commander was hesitant about confronting the United States. Khamenei wanted a different Air Force commander who was less reluctant, more confident. If that's the case, that would put these stories about the Khamenei-Ahmadinejad disagreement in a different context, wouldn't it?
Well, when put in a different context, it actually highlights exactly what I'm saying. It's not about ideas, it's about turf. In other words, in fact, the very fact that Khamenei has adopted, has become so vocal, regardless of what he's saying, has become so vocal, is essentially basically reacting to Ahmadinejad impacting his turf. But there are other issues. It's not only about foreign policy. One is that Ahmadinejad from day one was anti-clerical, and he still is. I mean, most people don't know that the majority of clerics in Qom barred him from coming to the city, wouldn't meet with any of his representatives, and they still don't. I mean, he still is engaged in some kind of a détente with senior-most clerics in Qom. First of all, I mean, as I said, he's anti-cleric. In Iran, some refer to him as a Luther. When he was running for president, he would say his campaign is about university versus seminary. Secondly, all of his dabbling with messianism has nothing to do with the fact that he wants apocalypse now, if you would, is that essentially what Ahmadinejad is saying. In Shiism, the clerics are the guardian of the community in the absence of the Messiah, of the hidden Imam. What Ahmadinejad is saying is that it is not the clerics who are the guardians, it's the presidency in Iran who's the guardian. So he's trying to institutionalize the entire justification for having clerics into the presidency. And the arguments of him and some in the Revolutionary Guards who support him is that to have an Islamic republic, you don't need the clerics. So this second generation lay people can lay claim to the religious justification. All of these are fairly disliked by the clerics who have very powerful voice when talking to Khamenei. Secondly, the business community in Iran doesn't like him at all. I mean, he's bad for business, not only because he's invited sanctions against Iran, but because, from day one, he threatened the business community. He wanted to shut down banks. He wanted to shut down the stock market. And they also have been tirelessly campaigning against him and his economic policies. In fact, 15 members of the Iranian parliament wrote a letter severely criticizing his economic policies. Had there been 70, he would have had to actually show up to explain himself. But 50 is not a trivial number. And in fact, whether Khamenei really believes in a tough line or not, handling Ahmadinejad might require him to be, holier than him on policy issues, while he at the same time chastises him and the like. So,
Ali Ibrahim from the Georgetown Law Center. I guess my question pertains to a broader level of regional developments and where Iran is situated. And as we see and as we speak, there appears to be some regional consensus being developed amongst the Muslim countries. And for instance, President Musharraf's robust trip to various Muslim countries, and including Iran. Do you see that this consensus, if it is a consensus, pertains to diffusing the tension between Iran and the US, or it is more like redefining the role that potentially Iran carries in that region? So I would appreciate your comments on that.
Well, I don't think all countries are involved in this or have want the same thing. In other words, the Arab countries in the Persian Gulf area want, in some ways they want their cake and eat it too. They want Iran to be contained, but without it ending up in war. So on one level, they push the United States, I think, and they themselves adopted a very hardline rhetoric, which is very dangerous rhetoric. It's a sectarian rhetoric, and it's a specifically anti-Iranian rhetoric. But at the same time, they're very worried that if things get out of hand, it can make Iraq look like child play. What happens there? So their piece in this is very different. President Musharraf is driven by other things. One is that he's now under enormous amount of pressure because of what's happening with the Taliban in Afghanistan. So he's trying for ways, I think, to make himself useful and acceptable and part of a solution in the region. Secondly, I think a lot of his trip in Iran was talking with Iranians about the Taliban. I mean, this had nothing to do with the Persian Gulf. The Iranians are seeing a Taliban restoration. Most people believe that the Taliban will be back in Kabul this year. And, the question is, how would Pakistan square this with Iran? And that is a huge part of the game. And the issue is that the Iranians don't care about Kabul. They care about Mazar-e-Sharif and Bamiyan and Herat and protection of their clients. And they've decided that the US is virtually no use here because it doesn't stand up to the Pakistanis essentially, and is not really engaging in Afghanistan. And the Iranians have been sort of pushing to sort this out with the Pakistanis on their own.
Thank you, Vali. Thanks for that last question, which helped to place some of the Iranian issues you described in a broader regional and international context. As I mentioned, we do have a reception prepared. I invite you all to join and to continue the conversation. And in closing, let me also ask you to, again, thank our speaker for